I bet we can start slowing down, I think.
Okay, well, as we get started with our presentation, I will ask people to turn your video off and mute yourselves so we don't have any distracting noises in the background. But welcome everyone. It was nice to see everyone's faces, even just briefly. I know we're all missing all of the great events that we usually have in the community where we get to see each other face to face, but it's nice that we're able to at least connect over Zoom. Our event today is co-sponsored by the Wilmette Community Association and the Wilmette Conservation Commission. So I'm Elizabeth Harper, I'm the chair of the Conservation Commission. We also have Ann Davis here, who's the president of the Wilmette Community Association. So we try to collaborate on one of these presentations each year that focuses on the natural world. And today we have Pam Hunt here with us from Audubon, and she's going to talk to us about dragonflies. So she'll be able to answer all the questions that you might have about dragonflies here in New Hampshire. If you want to type your questions into the chat, there's a little word bubble at the bottom middle of your screen. As you come up with questions as Pam is speaking, you can type into the chat any questions that you might have, and then we'll have a few breaks during the talk where you can answer questions. Okay. All right.
So
well,
what are we doing?
Over to Pam then. And
do you want us to unmute Elizabeth now and do all that or not?
No. So I think everyone should be on mute once Pam starts talking, unless anyone has any announcements that they want to make before we get started.
Okay.
All right. And then we'll have time for questions and time to chat at the end as well.
Do we turn off the video camera?
Yep, you can turn off the video and mute yourself, and then Pam will be visible. I'll turn mine off as well. And you can type any questions you have into the chat. Pam's going to share her screen with us so that we can see the images on her screen. All right. Okay, thanks, Pam.
You're welcome. Okay, I think. There we go. So welcome everybody. Thanks for coming to this talk from wherever you're hiding. You probably just had a little preview because the starter slide is not thing. But yes, this is about dragons and damsels. And this slide here basically tells us that it's not necessarily about insects, except that it actually will be. It's just a joke that I stick in there. This talk, unfortunately, is usually given live, obviously, and it's very fun then because I interact with the audience a lot. So in this case, I will not be asking you leading questions and testing your high school biology knowledge and things like that. My computer just said it's unstable. Hopefully it remains stable. So what I usually say with this slide is, what exactly is a dragonfly? And the answer is, a dragonfly is a set of flying eyes. The two really major things about dragonflies, one is that they've got this amazing ability to fly with their forewings, and two, that they've got these actually ginormous eyes. So when someone asks you to say that dragonflies are flying eyes, which is all very important in terms of some of their biology, as we'll get to later. You'll be hearing me calling them odes or odonata. That's the actual scientific order that these things are in. Refers to their chewing jaws. And I often say odes because that's what us aficionados call them. These guys have been around a very long time. They're among the very first insects on Earth. Very certainly one of the very first group of flying insects. 300 million years ago, there were dragonflies with 2-foot wingspans flying around, and if there were people around, then they would have been attacking our children and our cats and all that sort of stuff. They got small over the years. This one here is from only about 150 across, or maybe even less. They got smaller as oxygen levels in the atmosphere declined and other things got into the air. But they've been around a long time, and they've hardly changed at all in that whole time. This is a good primer for refresher for high school biology. Insects' bodies are divided into 3 sections. The head, which in all cases is to do with sensation. They've got these big eyes. in the case of dragonflies, if we were to try to proportionalize our heads to theirs, if we had eyes as big as their eyes we would have a football helmet on either side of our head. So just imagine walking around and being able to see 360 degrees in a totally different way with all these little tiny photoreceptors that make up each compound eye. You may see sticking out just in front of the eye a little tiny black stick. That's the antenna. Dragonfly antenna, unlike most insects, are really tiny. They serve no significant function. Most insects use them for chemical sensing, pheromones and looking for prey and things like that. Whereas dragonflies just don't even bother. They're totally visual. So if you see dragonfly artwork, like on a mug or earrings or something, and they've got big curly antenna like a butterfly, well, they're wrong. You should just rip those things off and never frequent that artist again. So yeah, dragonflies do not have very useful antenna. And then of course below the eye there is their mouth with all those chewing mouth parts. So they catch the yummy food, it goes in to the thorax. This is the locomotion center if there were one. It's got the 2 pairs of wings and the 6 pairs of legs. I mean 3 pairs of legs, 6 legs. Dragonfly legs actually are only used for perching. They actually can't like walk. Some damselflies will sort of crawl a tiny bit, but not really anyway. But they also use them to catch prey, though, so you can see the spines on those front legs. They will fly with those in like a little net, and that actually helps in catching larger insects while they're flying. Going through the thorax are obviously, some of the body organs, the parts of the digestive system, the heart, such as it is in an insect, is in there. And then finally it all goes down to the abdomen. Again, digestive system comes out the end of this, but the other important piece of the abdomen is where the sexual organs are. At the very, very end of the abdomen is where the male produces sperm and where the female lays her eggs. We'll see pictures of some of those later. Those 2 little things sticking out the back side of the abdomen are called cerci. They will prove important later. And in the males, if you see where this male's got this, I don't know if you can see my arrow, this wide area at the base of the abdomen. And in the males, there's a secondary set of genitalia there that we'll also talk about shortly. So head, thorax, abdomen, sensing, moving, and mating, if you think about the 3 pieces there. One of the most common questions we get is what's the difference between the 2? And this is when I usually quiz the audience, so you guys are off the hook there. You can quiz yourselves. But the basic differences are visible in these 2 pictures. On the right is a damselfly. Damselflies are in the suborder Zygoptera, which means equal wing. Dragonflies are in the suborder Anisoptera, which means unequal wing. If you look at this picture, the damselfly's wings are all the same exact shape. They line up, all 4 of them, in a perfect, shape there. The dragonfly wings, the front wings are narrower at the base than the hind wings, and so they're not the same shape. That's the core difference. Some other common differences are that damselflies almost always hold their wings folded over their back, like this one, and dragonflies almost always hold their wings open all the way. There's intermediates in both cases, which makes it fun. And damselflies are entirely much more slender. Very long tapered abdomens versus the dragonfly here on the left with this stocky abdomen. Damselflies also have a little bit like a hammerhead shark head. You can see the head on top of that guy there. Dragonflies more of a round head. But there are some dragonflies with a little bit of a hammerhead thing going. People often think that damselflies are just smaller than dragonflies. Well, this is not always the case. For example, these 2 species here, which are both from Costa Rica, the damselfly is actually about 6 inches long and has a wingspan of about 5 to 6 inches. It's actually one of the largest damselflies on Earth. Whereas this dragonfly is actually only about 1.5 inches long with a wingspan of maybe 1.5 inches or 2 inches, one of the very small ones. There's some smaller than that, but size is, in North America, most dragonflies are big and most damselflies are small, but size is not the important thing. It's wing structure and body structure. Okay, so one of the most cool things about dragons and damsels, and I'll say dragon, it means both, is their life cycle. they're really aquatic organisms. Their larval stage in the water often lasts a year or more. There are species that will spend 4 or 5 years as a larva in the water. The flying adult generally lives only a month or two, usually because the wings wear out, they get damaged, they get eaten, and they can't fly, they can't feed, and they can't mate. So when the wings get too worn out and damaged, they're doomed, and that's when they kind of end their functional adult life. This is an adult male of a species called the Williamson's emerald. Doesn't really matter, but he's patrolling a territory. Most male dragonflies and some damselflies are territorial. They'll set up a stretch of riverbank or pond shore where they fly back and forth, chasing other males away, perching on grasses and things if they that so inclined to sort of state this is my claim. And they're doing that because they're waiting for females to show up at that pond or that river to mate. When a female does show up, the male's first task is to grab her. So here's a pair. The first position in the insect Kama Sutra is what's called the tandem position. And the male here on the right is holding the female by the back of her head with those cerci, those claspers at the end of his abdomen. In fact, most females have little depressions and things on the backs of their heads that those male pieces fit, almost like a lock and key in the damselflies. Dragonflies are a little less specific. They kind of just grab stuff. So this male's grabbed this female. That's a means of protecting her from other males getting in the way and interfering with his mating attempt. But he now has a challenge because if you recall, his sperm are produced at the end of his abdomen where he's grabbing her head. Those need to go to the end of her abdomen. You can actually see this little bit down below her tip of her abdomen. That's her ovipositor. He needs to get sperm from the tip of his to the tip of hers. And right now he's holding her head with it. If he lets go, she'll fly away. Another male might show up and interfere and steal her from him. So he's trying to guard her. And what he will have done, either during the tandem position or prior, he will have curled his abdomen all the way around to the base and inserted the sperm into those secondary genitalia. There's actually a little organ there that's essentially a penis that stores sperm. So once the sperm are safely stored there, they can enter the second position called the wheel position, where the female will curl herself forward and place her ovipositor against that male's secondary genitalia, at which point fertilization happens and they're good to go. There's a second set of structures in the male's secondary genitalia called hamules, which are like little pooper scooper looking things. And they are actually used to actually remove sperm from the female if she's already been mated with. So if a male finds a mated pair, chases the male off, grabs the female, he can actually remove the other guy's sperm before he puts his in there. Those crazy things that dragonflies do that people probably should not try at home. So once she is fertilized, she's going to go lay eggs. There are 2 means of laying eggs. In all the damselflies and then the darners, like this dragonfly here, you can see this little spiky thing at the bottom of her ovipositor. That is her ovipositor. That's what she actually inserts into plants and lays the eggs inside, in this case, these fallen over grasses. And the eggs will hatch inside that plant. The larvae will fall out into the water. They don't like live in the plant and then start swimming around in the pond. All the other dragons will do a sewing machine maneuver where you see a female flying around, dipping her abdomen into the water. And each time she does that, she's laying eggs. Depending on the size of the dragon, a female could lay from 50 to 200 eggs in a bout, most of which will obviously get eaten or not hatch. And she can do that multiple times a season as long as she doesn't die. So she can lay a bunch of eggs, then go off into the woods and get some more food and avoid the annoying males, come back, lay a bunch more eggs, and do that again 2 or 3 more times, depending on how she's doing. So those eggs are hatched right away most of the time into the water. They turn these little tiny larvae, and those larvae grow. They shed their skin. They grow. They shed their skin, going through several instars, from 7, 8 more, depending on how long they live. And as they get bigger, they get more and more ready to actually metamorphose, whatever the word is. So this picture here is a larva that's very close to coming out of the water. In fact, That's why I've got a picture. It was near the surface. It was no longer hiding deep into the bog. It was near the surface. I caught it, put it on top of the sphagnum moss here to get a picture. You can see in the middle of its back, there are these what we call wing buds. Those don't show up until the final instar of these larvae, and that means this guy's ready to climb out of the water and turn into an adult. So what they do, they will climb up on a vertical surface, whether this is a bridge abutment, or maybe a cattail or a shrub, anything that's next to the water. They climb out of the water onto this thing. Again, you can see the wing buds there, and then they will split open the back of their thorax, and the inside of the dragonfly, the inside will pop out like this. So there's the adult version of the dragonfly shedding its final skin, essentially, is the larval skin there, which is going to be left behind after this dragonfly comes out. And those leftover skins are called exuvia. Here's another guy perched on the exuvia. It's opened his wings all the way up now, and it's going to rest there a little while before it decides to fly away. And these leftover exuvia, there's 2 of them here. You can actually identify those as species. It's really fun to paddle along rivers and collect them off the bank and then take them home and see what kinds of dragonflies were there. Now, what I tell people is if you see a larval dragonfly out of the water, this one was on the bank of a river, and I picked it up, put it on my net while I was kayaking. Unless you're bleeding to death or giving birth or something equally traumatic and time sensitive, just sit there and watch it. You might have to wait 20 minutes, you might have to wait almost an hour, but you're gonna see what you're gonna see here, which is a time-lapse set of pictures that I've just stuck together in animation of the dragonfly coming out of its larval skin. You can see that it's already hatched. There's a little fuzziness at the very top in the middle here. That's the fur, the hairs on the back of the adult dragonfly that have already split through the back. So this thing had already split its shell by the time I found it. What you're gonna watch now is it takes about 20 minutes from here to the final picture. And we'll just watch it and you guys can go ooh and ah, and then I'll do it one more time and give it some narration. Was that cool or what? So let's do a little more time. So what's going to happen? The first thing that's going to happen is it's going to pop it out of that original crack. Basically, the head and thorax come out really quickly. And then it sits there pretty still for a while the legs and the muscles kind of get reorganized a little bit because it's kind of cramped from being in there. And it's totally going to lunge forward, grab the substrate, and pull its abdomen out very quickly. And then pumps water and blood into the wings and abdomen to expand them out. And when it's done expanding the wings out, it actually withdraws the blood back into the body. Dragonfly wings are brittle. They do not actually, those veins are structural rather than circulatory. So they're just there to make it stronger. So if you tip the break of a wing off of the end of a dragonfly, it usually can still fly once the wings are fully hardened. So this guy is now ready to take off. First of all, they'll open the wings up. This is called the teneral dragonfly. It's just hatched. It's still very soft. The wings are very shiny and very soft. They're kind of like saran wrap. And you can see the front right wing is all gnarled up. That happened presumably because as this dragonfly was emerging, that wing got caught on the rock. It got caught on some of the vegetation. The wind blew and something happened, or a drop of water fell on it. Almost anything, just like saran wrap. If that gets stuck to itself, it's a disaster. It can no longer pump blood in there to expand it out. So this dragonfly cannot fly. It's got one club wing essentially. So that's a major cause of mortality and loss of dragonflies is just mortality during this very sensitive emergence phase when they're very soft, very vulnerable predators and so forth. But if it survives, it's going to fly off into the woods or fields nearby and just sort of lie low for about a week, depending on the species, sort of maturing sexually, getting hardened, eating a lot of food so it can, come back to the wetland and lay eggs or whatever else. And if it's a male, it'll come back to the well and set up its territory, and the whole thing will start over again. So at this point, I traditionally ask, and I will do the same thing now. I don't know if there's any chat questions. If anybody has any questions about the reproductive cycle, we can take a couple of minutes here to answer those, because otherwise, well, it's fresh in anybody's mind. So if anybody does have a question, you gotta type it into the chat or unmute yourself or have Elizabeth unmute you and ask it in person. And if not, I will blithely continue on. It doesn't look like anything.
Well, I'll
Yeah,
ask one
go.
question while others might be trying to. So Ann and I were talking before, before we started, and wondering, as you see them emerge, is that dragonfly, has it been in there for a year, for 6 months? How much does that vary between species in terms of how many instars they have and how long it takes before they emerge?
Yeah, each species is pretty consistent, and the number of instars is going to be consistent within species, with some variability depending on temperature, because temperature is key. Most species, it's about a year. So you see dragonflies this summer laying eggs. Those eggs, the ones that make it, will hatch out next spring and summer. The species that take longer in the larval stage tend to be ones that live in colder climates like northern areas, or relatively unproductive water bodies. So cooler things like large rivers, large lakes, where there's not like really warm, tons of yummy food to eat. So those ones will actually take, multiple years. And there's a few species, we'll talk about a couple of them later, that actually have a very short larval period on the order of, weeks, less than 2 months. But most of them is going to be about a year to several months where they're going to be living in the larval stage.
Okay. So there is one question in the chat. Someone would like to know, how are the numbers of dragonflies looking, in terms of population numbers, and are their habitats being threatened? Are they currently available?
We will get to that. There's more coming.
Okay.
There's, pay attention, people.
Okay, we'll wait.
Reproductive questions. No, just kidding. Yes, we will get to those sort of questions shortly.
Great.
All right, I'll continue. Sounds like that's it for now. If I forget to answer that question, by all means, then you can give me shit. How come my screen isn't moving forward now? There we go. So the next question, this is the whole section here about sort of the biology of these guys is not reproductive. And the question that comes up oftentimes, what do they eat? And the quick answer is anything smaller than they are. So here's a tiny little damselfly. She's about 1 inch long. She's eating a damselfly that's about 0.8 inches long. They eat other dragonflies, other damselflies, anything, damselflies mostly fly around catching bugs that are sitting on leaves. Dragonflies get most of their prey while they're flying. The larvae living in the water eat mostly aquatic, other dragonfly larvae. They'll eat small tadpoles, tiny fish, other aquatic invertebrates. The larva actually has a very cool extendable jaw that shoots out with claspers at the end, like half the length of their body sometimes, and actually grabs things and pulls them back in, and then they chew on them. Some of the larger guys will eat larger things. This is a dragonfly called the dragon hunter, one of our largest, eating a tiger swallowtail. We were watching this thing and it's chomping away, eating the yummy head first, and then the wings just fall off because they're not very tasty and they dribble to the ground like weeds. And dragon hunters are pretty notorious because they are basically apex predators, and the next picture may shock people, but that is a dragon hunter that took down a hummingbird. Whether or not, this is not my picture, so I stole this. Whether or not they successfully managed to eat these things or even kill them is another story, but it actually was able to hit it, grab it, and bring it to the ground and probably chew on it a little bit. But sometimes their eyes are way bigger than their stomachs, but that just is a testament to exactly how actually super impressive these things are as predators. Anything smaller than they are, and some things that are actually bigger than they are. And of course, turnabout is fair play, so what eats them is anything bigger than they are. So here's a dragon hunter again, the same species, just eating a hummingbird, being eaten by a catbird. You can see it's shiny and bright green. It's a young one just actually hatched. We were watching it hatch. and it flew across the river, and as soon as it got to the other side, this catbird came out of the bushes, attacked it, and took it down and carried it off to eat somewhere else. That's quite the meal for the catbird. So other dragonflies eat other dragonflies. Frogs, turtles, fish eat the larva. This is another fun story. We've got a praying mantis that actually caught a pair of darners that were in tandem. The male blurry coming at us in the foreground and the female in the center. They came apart when they got caught, and the male was frantically trying to fly away, probably ultimately unbalanced the praying mantis, who let go of the male and then let go of the female. So they both actually escaped from this thing, but the mantis was probably thinking, I can do this. I've got two now. I'm going to get so much yummy food. And of course, a very unknown thing that eats dragonflies are the occasional plant. This is the sundew that caught a very tiny female damselfly, the same species actually we saw eating another damselfly at the beginning. So they'll eat anything smaller than they are, and they get eaten by anything bigger than they are, and in case of this, a couple of things smaller in some ways than they are. They're entirely carnivorous. There are people sometimes wonder whether dragonflies are pollinators or not. Nope, they are always eating other animals. The other fun thing about them, to get to that previous question, is the habitats. And I'll tie in the Pacific question here as we do it. Dragonflies are very, very adaptable. They're basically any freshwater habitat on Earth that's not frozen is occupied by some species of dragonflies or damselflies. This is a little retention pond near about a mile from my house. It's really mostly dry right now, but it's full of cattails. It's also full of probably road salt and other junk coming in off the roads. It's got trash in it. It's had one of those little driveway basketball hoops in it for a long time, shopping carts, all that sort of stuff. And yet that pond, I've recorded over the years 45 to 50 species of dragonflies. So it's a perfectly acceptable habitat. As long as the water quality is not terribly bad, they really don't worry so much about, the landscape that they're in. Certainly places like this beaver pond, full of yummy dead trees, yummy, I don't know why I said yummy, full of beautiful dead trees, lots of vegetation, lots of food in there, lots of places to lay eggs and hide, are your sort of default habitat to get a good diversity of dragonflies. Any little roadside pond, marshy place is going to be good. Marshy, too many cattails, there's fewer species because they like some open water. There's also a whole bunch of species that wouldn't be caught dead in a pond that would much rather prefer streams. They can be in sort of small sandy-bottomed shaded streams like this. They can be in very small, rocky, high gradient streams up in the mountains and headwaters. And they can be in the really big rivers like the Merrimack and the Connecticut and the Saco. And different species like different types of rivers, again, based on the characteristics of the sediment and the flow and oxygen content and things like that. Some of our species that we think are probably more at risk than others are going to be some of the river species, because if you put a dam on a river, just like it messes up things like fish passage, it also can change sediment characteristics. And species that like flowing water may disappear from highly impounded sections of the rivers. Happen not so much in New Hampshire, but other parts of the world where there's less water in particular. One of the coolest places for dragonflies that are kind of fun are bogs. This is actually Crescenti Bog, not too far from Wilmot Folks over in New London. Bogs are full of northern species that have affinities to the boreal forest in Canada. So there's often some really cool species in bogs that are, not found very much farther south from here. And there's one species found in salt marshes on the New Hampshire coast. It's called the seaside dragonlet. The names of these guys are often quite, we'll talk about the names in a bit. The seaside dragonlets are found in salt marshes all the way from, eastern Canada down the east coast through the Caribbean and up the Pacific coast of Mexico. The only saltwater dragonfly in the world. And we have them right here in New Hampshire. Okay, so here's another point where people can ask any questions before we get into a fun little overview of critters, in case there's anything I forgot, because I sometimes forget things in terms of basic cool biological facts in general. There'll be more fun facts coming up as we go through the species here, but if there's any other questions,
Hi Pam, this is Ann Davis. I tried to write a chat question and was not successful. So, you know, I was curious with our current precipitation deficit. Concord Monitor in today's paper, it's about 10.25 inches below normal. What kind of effect will that have on dragonfly populations next year?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. And there's a good chance that there's going to be a lot fewer. You know, a lot of small, normally shallow, happy little marshy ponds are basically dried up. Tiny little streams are dried up. So anything that has a larval stage that requires the water, those larvae are going to probably die. Or at least lots of them are going to die in certain parts. So maybe some ponds will be a little better off that are a little wetter. Some streams will be a little wetter, but lots of these smaller ponds are going to get either dry out entirely or get too warm and too hot during the peak of the season. And the warmer the water is, the less oxygen is in the water, and that may affect their ability to even breathe. That happens to fish a lot. Fish die if it gets too warm in a pond. So I wouldn't be surprised if there's going to be fewer, especially of the pond species, out in this next summer. The river stuff is probably going to be a little better off. The Merrimack is like very low right now, but it's not dry. There's still plenty of substrate in there, and those larvae that are in there can just sort of swim deeper into the river as it goes down. But yeah, that's an excellent question. Given the current circumstances, we will probably be seeing fewer of certain kinds of damselflies and some of the pond dragonflies next year. Unfortunately, we don't have any good data from this year to compare to next year, but that's a good moving point. Excellent question. Bonus point. Any others? See, yes, they're just bashful to ask questions when it's not in real life. All right, so onward. This is going to be the fun part. If you're already having fun, so there's an overview of some of the species we have in New Hampshire. We'll get to the number of species later. Maybe I'll quiz you. But there are 9 families of odonates, 3 damsels and 6 of dragons. And we're just going to go through each of these to a greater or larger extent, giving you examples, maybe telling some fun stories about other dragonfly facts, in case you forgot to ask them. The first one are the broad-winged damsels, which for some reason my slides, there we go. Every time I take a pause, it does something. You may have seen this one. This is a very common species in small wooded streams, small rivers. It's called the ebony jewelwing. Like I said, some of the names are quite fun. They were only given common names about 25 years ago by a committee of the Dragonfly Society of the Americas. For some of them, we suspect they had some fun drinking games involved. But all of the broad-winged damsels have very shiny metallic bodies. Most of them are green. There's one that's red. And all have some sort of pigmentation in the wing. Usually these guys have a lot of black. There's one with a bit of red. But they're very common in various streams all over the state. The males actually do some very fascinating little territorial dances where they flit at each other, like challenge each other as they're in the edge of the territories. Far less charismatic are the spread wings, which is one of the examples that proves the rule of damselflies holding their wings folded together. These guys obviously don't, hence the name. They're all kind of this bluish, greenish, beigeish color with these nice blue eyes, but otherwise a pale blue and brown, white striped thorax and a sort of beigey brown abdomen. Very, very hard to tell apart. Usually you have to look at those male claspers at the end of his abdomen to tell them apart. What's fun about these guys, and they might be maybe better off depending, if they made it this late in the season, they're a late season group. They lay their eggs like all damselflies in some sort of vegetation, but those eggs spend the winter as eggs and hatch out in the spring when spring rains fill these pools up, almost like vernal pools, but not necessarily. So some of these might be a little better off if they can survive, being dried out at the edge of these wetlands in the current situation, and they don't get killed in the winter. They might be a little better off next spring compared to things that are active during the summer. We just don't know. Most damselflies around here are in this pond damsel group. You've probably seen these little tiny blue ones, about an inch long, blue with black markings. There's other ones, there's purple ones, there's some greenish ones. Very common. There are probably 30 or so species in this family alone in New Hampshire. And most of them look like this. There's lots of little blue guys. These are called the bluets, the genus Enelagma. This is one, this is another. Those are two completely different species. And the only way to tell them apart safely, well, there's other ways, but to make it easy, is to look in very closely at the end of the male's abdomen. This is with a microscope, but you can also do it with a magnifying glass or a little loop. But, you know, there are about 12 to 15 of these blue damselflies that can be very hard to tell apart unless you actually catch them to look at the male's claspers. There is, of course, exceptions to that. Now, these guys are called bluets. That's a marsh bluet. This is a scarlet bluet, one of the more original names of a damselfly, because it's a bluet like the other bluets, same genus, but obviously it's red. We will talk more about this species near the end, because it's actually one of my favorite dragonflies. Okay, on to the dragons. The darners. The darners are on average the biggest. If you see, sorry, no one asked this, big swarms of dragonflies flying over your yard, sometimes over top of a mountain, they're mostly going to be darners, maybe some emeralds. They're big feeding swarms that are taking advantage of concentrated insects, usually hatching flying ants, or if you're on top of a mountain, it's often wind currents forcing bugs higher up in the air and they're just flying around catching them. This is a very common species. You can recognize it by the bright blue sides of the abdomen and the green thorax. It's migratory. So kind of like a monarch butterfly, in the spring, they will arrive in late April, mostly in May. They will lay their eggs in some little pond. Those eggs will take a couple of months to develop. They go very quickly because it's warm and there's lots of food in these warm, shallow beaver ponds. They will hatch out and then it will fly south. Unlike monarchs, which basically go to Mexico and park themselves and don't do anything, because these are predators, very active insects, they can't just like hibernate like the monarchs do. They actually go through a couple of generations down in the winter grounds, whether it's Florida or the Caribbean or Mexico or something like that. We really haven't got a good feel for what they do. But they show up here in spring, mate, die, their offspring go south in the fall. People have put radio transmitters on these in Cape May, New Jersey, and watched them fly across Delaware Bay to Delaware. So they're very accomplished flyers. They can go, 1,000, 2,000 miles during a migration if they need to. At the same time, there's a population of the same species that lives in the Northeast that is not migratory. So if you see a green darner in May, it's a migrant. If you see a green darner now, it's a migrant. If you see a green darner in from late June to early August, it's probably a local one that lives in the pond, hatches out in early summer, late spring, lays eggs, dies, and those larvae hatch and they grow over the next year and hatch out again the following spring. So there's one set of the population that has an annual cycle and one with a very short-term migratory cycle. And they probably intermingle a little bit, but there's two different strategies for dealing with the changeable environment in some of the darners. It's kind of cool. Also very popular are the clubtails. These are mostly river species. They get their name because their abdomen usually is expanded at the end like this one. They're often quite beautiful with these greens and yellows and blacks. Very popular with dragonfly enthusiasts because of the coloration, because they're often very secretive and hard to catch, make them a bit more of a challenge. These ones, maybe more so than lots of others, are sensitive to environmental perturbation because they are river species, many of which are also northern or that really like cooler waters. So if we put a dam in and it changes the water temperature and the sediment, some of the clubtails will be less likely to be there, some of the big river species. And the king of the clubtails is our friend again, the dragon hunter. This is my hand it's on. So this bug is actually 3.5 inches long with 3 or 4 inch wingspan. You see them cruising up and down rivers looking like little Black Hawk helicopters. You can play the Ride of the Valkyries from Apocalypse Now. You can use any kind of cool metaphor you want. These guys are vicious predators and they're after, you know, hummingbirds and small children. And just very, very cool bug. You can see the little dinky antenna there. Mentioned these two families very briefly. They look very similar. A lot of them look like clubtails. They're again river species with the similar characteristics of black, brown with yellow stripes, green eyes. The spike tail, it gets its name, like this one shows, this pointy ovipositor. The female actually sticks that down into mud and lays her eggs in the mud at the edge of the streams. Otherwise, they don't have any really exciting stories. They're cool, but they're not much different than clubtails. Another large group are the emeralds, so named. You might be able to guess by most of them have very brilliant emerald eyes. They're otherwise not usually very well marked. Usually some sort of metallic bronzy green on the thorax, you know, the dark abdomen with some sort of brown spots here or there or rings. These are a very northern group. There's a few species in the southern United States, are very rare in the Caribbean or South America. So they're northern species. These ones often going to live, you know, as nymphs as larvae for a couple of years in the northern bogs and things like that. Also very, very hard to catch. They don't land very often. And one of them is this kind of cool picture here. I always ask audiences what's different about this picture, and the answer once they get to it is the fact that this was taken at night. Most dragonflies are active during the day. There are a half dozen or so species called shadow dragons that are crepuscular. They come out at dusk. They fly around over rivers catching food for half an hour or so and then go hide up in a tree the rest of the day until it gets dusk again to go out and catch things again. So it's kind of fun to realize that there's almost a nocturnal dragonfly out there. And this one has probably the best name of any organism I know of. It's called the Stygian shadow dragon, you know, so named the river Styx, the river in the Greek underworld. So it's dark and spooky, and it's a river. So this is a river species that is active at night. So it's just got a very fun. And this was like about a few hundred yards from my house. So I was wading up to my chest in the river with a net and catching dragonflies one evening several years ago. Okay, finally, the dragonflies people mostly can see, they're usually very brightly colored, they're very distinguished looking. These are the skimmers. You know, probably close to a third of the species we have in New Hampshire are skimmers, quarter of the species maybe, not counting, of dragonflies. So in many cases, the skimmers are sexually dimorphic. So the males are going to be like birds, much more boldly colored than the females. This guy here is something called the common whitetail for obvious reasons. He's got this brilliant white tail, which is actually formed from this sort of waxy excretion on his abdomen, kind of like the blush on a plum or an apple. And then he's got these brilliant black markings on the wings. That's the male. He's sitting there going to chase other males away. The female, on the other hand, is very cryptic. You know, totally different wing pattern, totally different body pattern, kind of blends in with, you know, the forest floor and where she wants to perch. And it might be because this makes it harder for them to get seen by predators when they need to lay eggs, or maybe even harder for them to be seen by males when they're not ready to mate. Another great example of this is this guy called the eastern pond hawk, where the male is this bright powder blue and the female is bright grass green, blending in quite nicely with vegetation. A very common group of skimmers you probably have seen, and one of the few species that's still out right now, are these little red dragonflies that you see in fields and the edges of ponds. These are called meadowhawks. So you can impress your friends by saying, well, hey, look, there's a meadowhawk. There's like 6 species. They're not always easy to tell apart without catching them, but get it to meadowhawk, people will be impressed enough. And this is something I forgot to mention, and no one's asked me yet, so I'm going to mention it now, because it shows up really nicely on this picture. There's these 4 red rectangular pieces in each wing. Each wing has this pigmented spot. These are called stigmata, or pseudostigmata. They're believed to be functioning as little balancing things. So the extra pigment in each wing actually makes that end of the wing a little heavier, so the dragonfly can sort of know where the end of his wing is. And just as it flies, it can sort of sense where the ends of the wings are, so it's knowing when to, you know, maneuver and various things like that. And here we have our smallest dragonfly in New Hampshire, one of the smallest ones in the world. This guy is like less than an inch long. It's called the elfin skimmer. It lives in little bogs. They're common at Crescenti Bog, if anybody goes up there next late May through July. This is the male. Females look like little bumblebees. Actually, they may even mimic bumblebees to make them less likely to get caught by something. But it's a very, very tiny thing. If you look at it, it's barely longer than the width of my thumbnail. Very adorable. The final skimmer I want to talk about is this guy. It's called the wandering glider. And in Europe, it's called the globe skimmer. And this is the only dragonfly that's actually found worldwide on every continent except for the polar regions. So it's not in the Arctic and it's not on Antarctica. It's been recorded on most islands, including Hawaii, out in the middle of nowhere. And one reason they're so widespread is because this whole group, the gliders and their relatives, actually can glide. Most dragonflies have to be constantly flapping, whereas these guys can actually get a boost from wind and uplift. They've got these really wide hind wings, kind of like a hawk or an eagle, that actually helps provide lift and keeps them, minimizes how much flying they have to do relative to how much distance they have to cover. So these guys will actually get carried by the winds across large distances. And I don't know how many of these there are, but there's actually a TED Talk about this species of dragonfly. If you want to look it up at some point, look up a TED Talk, wandering glider. And this guy is talking about how he sussed out the migration route of this creature around the Indian Ocean, where it gets blown by the monsoons from India to Africa, across the Indian Ocean to land in Africa, where it breeds and then works its way north again multiple generations until it gets back to India over the course of a year. This is one of those species where the larva lives longer than the adult, lives less than the adult, excuse me, the other way around. So they often breed in temporary rain pools after thunderstorms. Think about the monsoon situation. And those larvae can go from an egg to an adult in 6 weeks. So it's quite possible for an adult to live, 8 weeks and thus outlive its larval stage. You'll sometimes see them laying eggs on car hoods because they see them reflecting. They think they're temporary pools after a rainstorm, which of course is not a good place to raise your young as a dragonfly, as a car hood. Okay, so I'll open it one more time for intermediate questions. How are we doing for time? Pretty good. Maybe I'll skip the questions. We'll just get to the end. So that's an overview of the diversity of these guys and some of their biology. And I just want to talk a little bit about the status of dragonflies in New Hampshire, and specifically this project that I led several years ago, the New Hampshire Dragonfly Survey. That's our logo. We have a dragon hunter again, eating New Hampshire in this case. That's our logo. It's all based on a book that came out in 1973 by these two guys, one of whom I know, Hal White, who's in Delaware now. They identified 134 species from all the records they could find known to occur. Since then, we've added another bunch, and we now know of 160, whoops, I guess I don't have a slide for that. We know 166 species. One just was discovered a couple of years ago, a southern species that may be moving north. And so, this difference between 134 and 166 is largely due to amateurs warning after looking at dragonflies. Just like butterflies, back in the 90s, dragonflies became more popular. People started making field guides to it. Basically, one point of this slide is that none of these people are entomologists. There's an engineer, a French teacher, an ornithologist. They just love dragonflies. They're going out and collecting them. So we've learned a lot in time. So the picture on the left is New Hampshire counties, how many species we knew about in 1973 versus 2006. And you can see that back in 73, there was a very strong bias towards Stratford County, which of course is where UNH is. So while Durham basically contributed a significant amount, everywhere else in the state was kind of sparse. And when people started looking and going to other parts of the state, it jumped up rather nicely, so that such that the Merrimack Valley here in Merrimack and Hillsborough counties is actually very high diversity. You can do the same thing by town. I'm not going to go into details with the towns. But again, you can see Durham down there, the little purple thing. And up in the White Mountains, historically, there was a lot of action because people from Boston and as far away as Philadelphia would be able to take a train up from Boston to the White Mountains and explore the White Mountains looking for these cool northern things that they didn't have, you know, in the southern part of the New England, farther south. In fact, several species, the very first records of them for Western science were collected in Mount Washington at Hermit Lake at the bottom of Tuckerman's Ravine. So there's some historical fun stuff going on in the White Mountains for these guys. Of course, once people start looking, we found diversity everywhere. And all these purple towns, I can tell you the person involved and why those towns are purple, but we won't bother with that. Half of them are from me, you might be surprised. So anyway, given that there's still some big holes, for example, on the right-hand map, we decided to gather together Fish and Game in New Hampshire Audubon, started this project. The basic plan was to improve our knowledge of dragonfly distribution. To that end, we had workshops. We trained 250 people. Maybe a quarter of them, a fifth of them actually continued on to collect data. They collected it all over the state. But there was certainly a bias most of the time to the southern half of the state where all the people are. You know, Coos County barely got visited at all in 2008. So what we did the last 2 years, we got these little bio blitzes essentially where some number of people, usually from 5 to 10, would go north, spend a couple of nights camping up in Coos County and whacking the hell out of the bushes there to try to find what we could find and collecting some more data. And it was great fun. And you can see from this map that we actually did pretty well. You know, there's still high densities of coverage in the south. I don't think there might be 1 or 2 dots in Wilmot, so I'm not sure we have much data from Wilmot for reference. But some pretty good data from the northern part of the state as well. You know, we basically covered 221 out of 259 towns, 1,200 places, 18,000 records. Mostly due to volunteers. So this is a little shout out to the volunteers that were doing everything from losing their shoes to just having a good time. So the final few slides here are to talk about some of the results of this and some cool stories. This critter here, the ringed bog hunter, when we started this survey was considered an endangered species in New Hampshire. It's found in New England, it's only found in Maine, southern Maine, southeastern New Hampshire, eastern Mass, eastern Connecticut, and Rhode Island. And there's also a few in the Great Lakes area. So it was very rare. You can see the yellow dots there on the old map. We only had it from 7 towns. But we started looking more carefully and we found it in a whole bunch more towns. We actually doubled the number of locations known for this species over the course of that 5-year project. And as a result, we actually downlisted it from endangered to threatened in 2017. And we have since found it in a few more places, and we're actually in the process right now of writing a grant proposal with partners in New England to redo surveys across that range to see if we can update our databases on their distribution and see if they're still equally scarce. You know, the problem with this species is that most of the sites are in the heavily developed part of New England. So they're in southeastern New Hampshire, eastern Mass, Rhode Island, all those places where, you know, wetland loss and degradation from development are going to be a potential problem for the species. So the more we can learn about it and its habitat needs, the better. And that's as good a point to make sure I answer that question from the very beginning about conservation. We've mentioned things like the drought. We've mentioned things like this. I've mentioned, you know, rivers and damming and oxygen levels and substrate. But in general, dragonflies, for whatever reason, maybe because they've been around for 300 million years, are really robust. There are certainly rare species. There are certainly species at risk, more so in areas with less fresh water. So you think about, you know, places that are more drought prone. The southeast, there's probably more species that people are going to worry about in the southwest rather than the northeast here. Places like, you know, I know there's several species of concern in South Africa, which is also, you know, other places fairly arid. In New England, we've got a handful. This is one of them. A few other species we'll get to, but in general, most of them are in good shape. But obviously, they're at risk, just like anybody else is, for things like climate change and particularly habitat loss. I said I'd come back to the scarlet bluet, so here we are. Scarlet bluet is fun because it's considered a coastal plain and pond endemic. Until the 2000s, it was only known from Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut, Long Island, and southern New Jersey. In 2001, we found them in 3 places, New Hampshire, found a couple more after that. So by 2006, that map on the left, we had 5 towns for that species. We let people loose to look, and we found them everywhere. And we don't know whether this was because they're hard to see, because even though they're bright red, they're usually out on lily pads out in the pond, and you don't always see them. Or have they actually increased since then? You talk to people from, and they're, very common in southern Maine. They've made it all the way up the coast of Maine into New Brunswick now. So they're actually, far more widespread than we thought. We just completed a 2-year project looking at this and some other of these endemic to the northeast bluets. And there's probably more sites for this species in New Hampshire than anywhere else on Earth compared to the other states. It's like only 3 or 4 in New York, and there's like 9 in Connecticut. And maybe because up here they've adapted to different habitats. People thought they were coastal plain ponds. Well, we had them in Lake Winnipesaukee, which is by no means a pond, and we have a site up there in Berlin, which is not even the coastal plain. So in northern New England, they're doing something different than they are in southern New England and Long Island and New Jersey, which just makes it very fascinating to think about, the conservation and ecology of the species. They're concerned in southern New England and Long Island, but they're not in northern New England. There's a PhD thesis in there if anyone wants to try to get one. Couple more examples here. This is another little river species, which was unknown in the state until a colleague of mine found an exuvia in Boscawen, just north of where I live here. We started looking for exuvia, and we found exuvia all over the Merrimack, all on the Kentucook on the map on the right. We found an adult actually in Conway, and even on the Blackwater River there in Andover and Salisbury. I've seen adults of this species exactly twice. There's a photograph of one right there, and I saw another one in Conway, but I have seen dozens, if not hundreds, of exuvia. So this was the point of this slide, is that just because you don't find it doesn't mean it's not there if you're not looking for the right, easily detectable life stage. And there are several species of these river species that were previously considered rare in places like Massachusetts until people started looking for larvae or exuvia and realized that they were very common. People just were not seeing the adults. The last little example here is this little critter. You may have seen these. They should be, well, they're on the map there. They're in Sutton and New London, Springfield, so they're probably somewhere in Wilmot. You can go look for them next summer and fill the hole in. Is the eastern amberwing, a tiny little dragonfly with orange wings, very attractive, very distinctive. But in the 70s, it was only known in like 3 places down in the extreme southeast. 20 years later, it had spread up to the Lakes region, still pretty sparse in the western part of the state. But by the time we wrapped up the Dragonfly survey, they were pretty solid in the western part. And since then, I believe there have been records slowly creeping north. Some of these southern species like this are now north of the White Mountains. This one I don't think is. And this could largely be due to climate change, because ponds get warmer, they get more algae, other yummy things, they get more head bugs. These sort of very generalist, not very habitat specialized species can sort of take advantage of these warmer temperatures, more habitat, and slowly move north over time. Maybe some northern species are going to be impacted by climate change, and we're going to find that out obviously as we continue studying these guys. So if you combine all that stuff together, we had one more cool map here showing that basically we did a really good job of covering the state on the right there. We've got a bunch of towns that are purple. Purple means 75 or more species, which is close to half those known for the state. There's several towns there with an asterisk. That's out of date now. Those have over 100. The winners are like Barnstead, Amherst, Concord, Durham. Obviously, these are all places with high observer activity. What's really fun, I mentioned the West being dry and having less diverse habitats. There are more species in Concord than there is in California. And California is huge compared to Concord, but it has way less wetlands. There's very few large rivers. There's lots of very dry desert and dry coastal habitats. So the diversity of habitats in the West is way smaller than it is in the Northeast and even in the Southeast. So that we've got more species of dragonflies in Concord than in California. There's more species of dragonflies in New Hampshire than in Europe for more complicated reasons. I think dragonflies just did really well here. So yeah, so that's wrapping things up. So this project wrapped up almost 10 years ago now. It's hard to believe. So ideally, another 10 to 20, not 20 to 30. I should change this slide. We're going to redo this and see what's changed. Our species less common than they were before. That have ranges changed, and that'll help us reassess what sort of conservation issues we might need to focus on. And then finally, we just do another shout out to the volunteers. This woman has caught another kind of blewit. We're not sure what one. And at that, I can leave it open to even more questions. And if there aren't many, maybe we could just unmute everybody and let them ask them in a coordinated manner, because it looks like the chat wasn't really happening.
That's great, Pam. Thank you. Yeah, so if anyone has questions, you can feel free to go ahead and unmute yourself.
Ann Davis
So
again.
yeah, Ann and Mark just had like,
Can you recommend a field guide?
yes, and I need to put that slide in here. There are two options for the beginner odontist. There is something called the Stokes Beginner's Guide to Dragonflies. It's one of those little small book. It's like this big. It doesn't have all the species, but it's very straightforward and simple to use. If you want to jump into it feet first, there is a field guide to the dragonflies and damselflies of Massachusetts. Oh, actually, if I do that, I'll get lost. If you Google that, you can probably buy it from Amazon for $100, but if you go straight to the Massachusetts Endangered Species Program, you can buy it from them for $20. So don't get sucked into people trying to make extra money off of it. Again, it's called the Field Guide to the Dragonflies and Damselflies of Massachusetts. Do I have it here? Yes, I do. You know, it looks like this. It's a stunning book. The photographs are not always the greatest. And some species we have in New Hampshire aren't in here, the northern ones, but most of them are in there. There's a few that we don't have until they move north. But that is a very affordable, very handy little book that's very good to have. If anybody wants to get a start on these guys. It's also good to get a net, a very lightweight aerial insect net to catch them if you need to. Good question.
So,
Anything else?
the New Hampshire Dragonfly Survey, do you have sort of protocol that are on a website somewhere that might allow a community group to go out and do a day of surveying to contribute data?
Well, we're not collecting data right now. The project ended in 2011. I still collect a little bit of data. The simplest thing is to just get a hold of me. The protocol was pretty straightforward. It's like go out there with a net and look for stuff. Ideally, you do it multiple times in a year because just like wildflowers and birds, different times a year have different species. So there are early species and late species and mid species. So ideally, you get out there like once in early June to late May, once in July, August, and once in August, September, because different species fly at different times. And obviously, on a sunny, warm day, late morning to early afternoon is the best time. And then you just go out there and catch a bunch of stuff, identify them, and see what they are. Where people are working on more systematic, standardized protocols, but you can imagine it's tricky with these things that are flying around all over the place. It's hard to catch them and count them.
Yeah.
There we go. Thank you, Kim, for putting in the link. Everybody's looking at the chat.
And thank you, Pam, for a wonderful talk.
You're very welcome.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Do we have any other
There's no questions?
I'll ask one more. I'm envisioning, so it felt like kind of a challenge to see that Wilmot didn't have very many records, and so it makes me think that we need to get out and start.
Get out there and do a bio blitz.
Exactly. So we've been trying to do, on a broader taxonomic scale, we've been trying to do sort of a bio blitz using the app iNaturalist.
Yep.
I'm wondering how well that works with dragonflies, because I know that to identify some of them to species requires, looking through a microscope at some features. Is that helpful to use iNaturalist for dragonflies, or is it too coarse?
No, obviously iNaturalist relies a lot on people taking pictures and having experts vouch for those. And so if it's a hard one, they better not be accepting random bluets without a good enough photograph. So you can still get data on the common obvious species that way.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to put that in the chat so that you guys can see that. If anyone takes any photos using iNaturalist, it automatically goes into our Wilmot BioBlitz that we're doing through the
cool.
Conservation Commission. So that's helping us to record data on any species. So you can use it for wildflowers or trees or anything. It's a nice way to learn how to identify species if you don't have an expert there to help you.
Yeah.
That would be great if we try to do that for dragonflies too.
Yeah. Vermont is using iNaturalist to collect data statewide on dragonflies, for example.
Great. Okay. Well, I think we've kept you past our time, Pam. Does anyone have any
That's
questions?
okay. It's usually rapid ask.
You're good? Okay.
Yeah. There's no more questions, though. We don't need to keep them either.
Okay. It sounds like we don't have any more questions, but thank you so much for that, Pam. That was really
You're very welcome. I'm glad to have
great
been able to finally get around to doing it, and hope everybody had a good time.
Yeah,
Yes.
that's great.
And
Thank you.
Ann Davis again, thank you, Pam.
You're very
We
welcome.
the talk will be available online through the WCA's website for a week. So if you want to go back and re-listen, I think you'll be able to do that. Just check the WCA Wilmot Community Association's website. Thank you so much for participating today.
Enjoy your fall, everybody.
Everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.